All right, I think I'm going to kick things off. Welcome, everyone. I'm Hoyt Long, Chair of the East Asian Languages and Civilizations Department. I'm actually filling in for Chelsea Foxwell, who is the Director of the Center for East Asian Studies, but who couldn't be here today, and she sends her regards. My role is simply to introduce the lecture series and then introduce the introducer, who will introduce our tonight's speaker. This lecture series was established in 2016. It's an initiative that advances the center's mission in fostering dialogue and interdisciplinary collaboration. It's done in partnership with the University of Chicago Library here. And it's an annual public lecture series that presents eminent scholars who concentrate on the study of East Asia in a variety of disciplines. The next lecture in the series will feature Princeton University's Janet Chen on Thursday, March 28th. So look out for that. And if you want information on this year's speakers and to register to attend, please see the poster located in the back of the room. Great. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce Professor Emerita Norma Field, who needs no introduction, and she will introduce tonight's speaker. So Norma, I will hand you the floor.
Hi, everybody. Since Hoyt was in the I'm standing in for mode, I should say I'm standing in for someone, too, who shall not go nameless as Professor Kyung-Hee Chen, I think. Anyway, I was just saying to Sam Perry that I feel like, and we settled on this animal together, a woolly mammoth, awakened because of global warming from the permafrost. You'll understand more. You'll see how I might be stuck in earlier modes of scholarship in my introduction. So think woolly mammoth, or the world I've inhabited since retirement the past 12 years is the world of nuclear contamination. And so I could imagine myself to be Godzilla, right? Awakened by. Anyway, enough of that. It's such a pleasure to be here to introduce Sam Perry, whom I've known for over a quarter of a century. And in trying to think about what I might say for someone who has such a vibrant, crammed CV of very solid accomplishment in so many ways, of which I'll elaborate on a bit. I was trying to think about what through line I find in his work and his presence here. And the first thing that came to my mind was how he came here with such a set of language knowledge and skills. He had already translated a substantial work of Japanese literature as his BA, and he had spent time in Germany. So there's German, and then I see fourth-year Chinese in there. And of course, he started Korean only when he came to graduate school. And look at the accomplished Korean scholar, translator he is now. And I think at some point he was hitting a low point in graduate school. Correct me if I'm wrong. And I think in order for a break, he decided to do Russian. He said he'd taken some Russian in high school, oh well, right? And there was a class being offered on Russian through Pushkin, so he did that. And so the issue of languages, and I want to really emphasize the S versus language, all sublime, which when I started teaching here, and certainly still through Sam's time, was very much exalted. In fact, language had really invaded other disciplines. So there was the linguistic theory of everything, the linguistic, where linguistic language-centered history, for example. And I want to say that Sam is certainly attuned to what language means, and I'll prove that in a minute, but that he took languages as something other than ancillary knowledge to more exalted, abstract forms of thought and scholarship. And literature. So translation always, translation comes first in the study of a remote place, right? So East Asia's translation had something of an honorable place, and then it slipped and slipped and slipped and became very secondary. Many, I would say even decades of forgetting that we wouldn't have anyone to teach really without translations. But the seriousness with which we tackled translation, and then that in turn, the serious engagement with something that almost is not, but is not quite dead or extinct, that is to say, literature. So I want to say, not so incidentally, Sam's work was what comes to be called transnational from the start, and that that translation he shows over and over through his pursuits is bidirectional. It's not just into European languages or into the newly awakened modern societies from English or other European languages. And that is certainly what he shows through proletarian literature, which at that time, the literature of the left, focused on workers, but not only, what labor means to the shape of a society and culture. Proletarian literature, which has been, by and large, consigned to not so benign neglect. He engaged in extraordinary archival research, digging up texts, looking for first editions, a kind of attentiveness, a caring about textual existence of a kind that I experienced really when I was a graduate student in Japan, working with a very different kind of text, The Tale of Genji. So it was that kind of respect that Sam brought to his work. And so you can look at his CV, and I'm just going to quickly address his published books. He has so many pieces. Oh, I forgot to mention that he's taken on Vietnamese, so watch out. Let's see what he's going to do next. Professor Che handed me this, which I don't have. I only read the introduction in one story, but newly published Century of Queer Korean Fiction, which in a very innovative way exists in 2 volumes, one in Korean. Both are edited and introduced by Sam, and this one obviously translated from the Modern Language Association. And then a text I don't have on me, though I've certainly read its contents, 5 Faces of Japanese Feminism, Crimson and Other Works by wonderful, wonderful proletarian writer, Sata Ineko. It's really a great read, and it shows you her extraordinary range, which is also reflective of the extraordinary range of proletarian literature. And then this book, which I do have, Recasting Red Culture in Proletarian Japan, Childhood Korea and the Historical Avant-Garde. And then another one I was able to locate, well found on my bookshelves, but I didn't bring, from Wansal Pon, which was translated 2 years after he got his PhD in 2009, the work of a really, really, really important Korean woman writer with historical introduction. So I just wanted to say, not to take away from Sam's talk, time from Sam's talk, there are a couple of things, and I'm going to work backwards, as he says, is his method in the arrangement of the Century of Queer Korean Fiction. Something he says in the long and detailed introduction, he's talking about the editorial decisions made for this volume, and he says things which, has a series of words which are all standard. Editorial decisions highlight diversity within the queer Korean experience to situate texts about non-conforming gender and sexuality within their historical context and showcase works that participated in the construction of broader systems of identification and desire. Okay, and then this is where I pause. May still mark the anthology as a product of the North American Academy. I thought, there you go, Sam, calling attention in a very conscientious way, in a scrupulous way, to how this work is situated, but the volume has been assembled in allegiance and conversation with a broader body of queer studies scholarship and a broader community of queer people. Okay, And another paragraph, in part for these reasons, most of the works included in this volume are not exemplary in their politics, but instead speak to the ways in which literary texts have been asked to perform cultural work that can, in retrospect, often be seen as highly problematic. So not exemplary, but I'm still going to treat them respectfully by including them here and in giving them my best as a translator, but also showing how that kind of tension is important. And here he puts it as problematic. I think the earlier Sam Perry emphasizes more the positive aspect of that ambivalence and tension. I'll get to that, namely on the role of bourgeois culture. And then another one, the literary works selected for this volume tend to embody a productive ambivalence, much more so than journalistic accounts. So again, showing us unabashedly the work that literature can do. Okay, now I want to give you some passages for reference going back to 2000. This was 2014. So where he says, in recasting red culture, I restore much of the forgotten ideological and aesthetic complexity of Japan's proletarian movement and show that it must be central to any understanding of modern Japanese culture in the early Showa period. Instead of focusing on the celebrated novels of proletarian literature, a body of fiction that was canonized in large part by the Japanese Communist Party, I excavate from the historical archive hitherto unexamined works of proletarian culture, fairy tales, children's songs, propaganda, wall fiction, as well as several works of poetry, fiction, and criticism about colonial Korea. These short narratives were not simply epiphenomena of theoretical debates of the time. There was plenty of that. The writers were all theorists and also people who would be gluing posters and preparing for imprisonment. So full-purpose human beings, full-purpose intellectuals and human beings they were, but constituted theoretically rich documents themselves and were engaged in a dialogue with historical events, broader intellectual and social practices, as well as questions of political consciousness and literary representation. I want to say that he says he's not going to, he's not using for his discussions the works that were canonized by the Communist Party, but he is also, he is not afraid to name the role of Japan Communist Party in that era and the work that it did. And that takes some courage because people tend to dismiss you off the bat for doing that, for taking a Communist Party seriously. And this is where I wanted to bring up what he says, not exemplary politics, engaging ambivalences, contradictions that may be problematic. So each of my, in this work, he says, each of my chapters also contributes to a closely related claim that proletarian culture was an indelible record of contradictions, a process whereby competing notions of literature, childhood, and Korean otherness, among other concerns, reflected that singularly complex effort to bring together revolutionary politics and bourgeois culture, which lay at the heart of the movement. Often he invokes Trotsky in this when he's doing this kind of thinking. And I often remember Trotsky too in his really, really great read, Literature and Revolution, in which he says about, many things that revolutions can change. He says, but not literature. It's going to take at least a century for a literature worthy of the revolution to be created because literature is organic and you can't rush the creation of a new literature. Anyway, so then I'm going to his dissertation, which was titled Aesthetics for Justice, Proletarian Literature in Japan and Colonial Korea. That's 2007. And he starts by quoting Raymond Williams, which he has in his work cited in the new work too, the new book too. And quoting Williams to say, We are coming increasingly to realize that our vocabulary, the language we use to inquire into and negotiate our actions, is no secondary factor, but a practical and radical element in itself. To take a meaning from experience and try to make it active is, in fact, our process of growth. So that's Raymond Williams. And that's kind of generic, and at the same time, it's the kind of thing people like to quote, but people don't actually put into practice. That's kind of what I was trying to say in Sam's, in the distinction between the attention he has paid to languages and what a difference that makes in his attention to language. So he says, while writing this dissertation, I myself have often shared proletarian writers' frustration, not that of the political world, but rather a similarly specialized academic discourse, where abstractions are often thought in and of themselves to somehow help lift one magically above the mediocrity and messy details of the quotidian. The gap between how we experience fiction as everyday readers and how those of us in the field of literature are often compelled to write about it seems to have grown immeasurably. I wonder if that still feels true. In no small degree, limiting the ways in which we as scholars can ourselves make active, as Williams puts it, those meanings we take away from our lived experiences, including the experience of literature. That's a lot, I know, a lot to be read to. So I apologize for that. But now Sam is going to exemplify this with his newest venture. And I think the work he did with proletarian literature, excavating the kingdom of childhood, as well as of Koreans in Japan and Korea, and then moving on to exploring queer fiction and all the contradictions it contains, as well as the fiction he studied earlier. I think that is what gives such, a thrill to the exploration Sam engages in. So we have the very intriguing title before us, and I'm looking forward to learning today. Thank you.
Oh my good! How do you follow that? Oh my goodness! Right, Norma. Thank you for that. The eloquence thank you for the very kind introduction. And I really stand here with no little sense of gratitude and real trepidation in front of so many of my mentors and now friends whose work has really inspired me in so many different ways. And encouraged me also to stray off the beaten path, so to speak. I do also want to thank Kyung-hee for inviting me in particular, and the staff of the Center for East Asian Studies for helping to facilitate this visit. And finally, and then to all of you who have come to hear me talk today, and finally, I just want to say that I hope I can learn from all of you in the Q&A period. This is somewhat of a new project for me, and so you'll learn that I have a lot of struggles as I'm dealing with this material, which in some ways is, personally speaking, much more closer to my own experiences in Asia even. Anyway. Given, I guess, my, just to refer to this very ambitious title, given my memories at the University of Chicago and the very, very rich intellectual world that this place in particular beckoned me into, I've sort of felt compelled to tick off a lot of boxes on that little abstract here. Always asked to write about 3 months before you actually give a talk or even write a talk, by addressing or touching on both Japan and Korea and literature and history, perversity, production. So I hope you forgive me if I don't come off as, or spread myself a little bit too thin in my lecture today and give a somewhat unconventional talk. I think I was writing the final paragraph 15 minutes ago in the coffee shop across the street. And again, this talk is in some ways much more personal, and surprisingly so. It actually brought me to tears at one point when I was writing parts of it. Then some of my other academic work, as you, of course, have learned from Norma, introduction, I've just stepped away from a queer Korea translation project that occupied my attention for about 7 years, but which has also led me to some surprise discoveries, as I have worked with librarians at Brown University to develop their queer Asian special collections and archives. The gay fiction that from the 1970s that I'll be talking about today is directly related to some of these discoveries. And I will just give everyone the quick heads up that a few of the images I'll be sharing are a bit risque and in some cases involve sexualized violence, but I'll do my best to tread lightly through what is in some cases quite pornographic material, which I still find enormously fascinating. So I'll begin by, there we go, putting up on the screen images of two very different stories published in the late 1970s. The first episode of a novella by Yamaguchi Jun, serialized in the popular gay magazine Barazoku, an episode called A Ruined Night. That's kind of how I've translated it, although I'm not sure if it's correct or not. Tsubusareta Yoru from 1977, and also labeled a work of SM Shosetsu, so in the sort of index to this journal, sadomasochistic fiction. The other is a piece, a short story by someone by the name of, I believe, Ozaki Gensuke, published in the gorgeously illustrated and yet short-lived magazine Murumu, My Way, My Life, several copies of which we have in the Brown University Library. I think the only copies in America. Appearing within months of each other. Both stories, at least in part, take place in Korea, and both draw importantly on sexuality and detailed descriptions of sex acts, though toward very different ends. So I think I'm going to, except for a few words of praise for Yamaguchi in reader response pages in Bara and Barazoku, I've never once found a single reference to or work of scholarship that mentions either Yamaguchi or Ozaki, nor have Yamaguchi's 24 or so largely autoethnographic works, or the handful of Ozaki's travel fiction that I've encountered at least, been reprinted in a book or anthologies. This is in no doubt in part related to their status as minor writers, but I think also speaks to the ways in which, or rather the paucity of scholarship on gay literature in Japan in some ways, a kind of scholarship that might resonate in particular with what Jack Halberstam in their Queer Art of Failure calls a disloyal historiography. Sorry, a difficult word to pronounce. Disloyal historiography. The effort, in other words, to complicate queer history and acknowledge the unsettling and politically problematic aspects of gay culture. I also suspect that in the case of Japan, this is also connected to a sensitivity to the way in which homosexuals have often been unfairly connected to fascism itself and for its sort of intensification of homosocial bonds and the concomitant crisis of heterosexual order in fascist systems, of which queer people also, in a sense, become symbolic and stigmatized for. If Ozaki's more progressive story makes a case for the importance of Japanese-Korean democratic solidarities in the face of corruption and oppression on the part of an undeconstructed colonial elite of both countries, making it a story that I guess is much more attractive to me, politically speaking. Yamaguchi's novella constitutes what I would suggest is a post-colonial gay Bildungsroman, one that traffics in wartime tropes and racialized formations in its celebration of a new kind of mainstream gay identity in the 1970s. So I'm going to expand a bit on Yamaguchi's story in particular, which takes its reader on a voyage of sorts from a wartime munitions factory on the Setoda Inland Sea, where 15-year-old Junji, the protagonist, endures the privations of conscripted labor and the terrors of sexual violence at the hands of gangsters, to an almost charmed lifestyle as an office boy in the Governor General's Office of Colonial Seoul, where after Japan's defeat, Junji is briefly enamored by American occupying soldiers, threatened by Korean criminals, all before eventually finding sexual companionship and emotional satisfaction with a Japanese boy a few years older than him. This path from violated child to confidently sexual adolescent, charted through a sequence of graphically pornographic scenes, indexes the growth of a Japanese teenager into sexual autonomy in a way that also seems to symbolically parallel Japan's more recent post-war transformation from a fascist wasteland and defeated, quite traumatized nation into a state of confident and prosperous post-war independence. Yamaguchi's work brings together questions of post-colonialism, wartime trauma, same-sex desire against the backdrop of wartime Japan and the American occupation of Korea, in ways that also speak quite specifically to the 1970s, a time when gay men in Japan, and of course straight men as well, were, with the lifting of the ban on international travel in the 1960s, beginning to travel extensively through the countries that had once constituted Japan's former empire. And when Japanese sex tourism to South Korea, also known as kiseng tourism, was, according to the historian Carolyn Norma, South Korea's most important source of foreign capital, at least in the early 1970s. So it would be quite easy to place Yamaguchi's fiction, on the one hand, within the historical context of a newly internationalizing Japan, anxious to re-engage commercially with its former colonies, and on the other, within the cultural context of post-war Japanese literature, popular fiction, and pornography, which in the immediate wake of Japan's defeat in World War II helped to certainly generate a wide variety of erotic narratives related to wartime experiences. One might say generously that Yamaguchi's work joins a long tradition of gay male narratives that sought to reclaim wartime trauma as a generative experience, recuperating the marginalized history of same-sex love and dilating it into a critical space for envisioning an alternative future. One might also follow the work of scholars such as Ishida Hitoshi and say that Yamaguchi's work shows us how gay male sexuality in Japan was also in the process of being normalized at this time, shedding its perverse affiliations with sex work, sadomasochism, and solidarities with non-binary and trans people, and also, I would add, in ways that also come on the backs of racialized groups in Japan and its former empire, the cost, in other words, of celebrating harmful forms of the imperial imagination. It's this mixed legacy of Japanese gay culture and its many contradictions that I hope to explore in, I guess, one of my many newest book projects that I've kind of envisioned for myself, a small portion of which I'll be sharing with you today. So I myself have been so seduced by the pleasures of archival work in the past couple of years that I find myself struggling to find an idiom with which to make connections between this gay, erotic fiction, broader questions of capitalism, transnationalism, racialization. But I do want to share my own aspirational position on studying this period of gay culture. And in the very broadest sense, I'm indebted to the work of Christopher Chitty and his posthumously published book, Sexual Hegemony, Statecraft, Sodomy, and Capital in the Rise of the World System, expanding ideas developed by Michel Foucault, but largely avoiding a dominant strain of queer theory that has eschewed Marxist politics for its ostensibly single-minded obsession with class and subsumption of gender and sexuality within it. Chitty adopts the term queer realism as a means of examining male homosexuality at the nexus of property relations and related cultural developments, seeing the scandal of sodomy in the classical Western world, for example, as something that was deployed in strategically contradictory ways. Chitty defines normality as, quote, a status that accrues material advantages to those who achieve it or happen to be born with it, and casts queer, in the words, I thought I had that down there, in the words of Chitty's editor, as, quote, a narrower descriptive category, signifying the lack of such status property, a property status. It captures the way in which norms of gender and sexuality get weakened, damaged, and reasserted under conditions of local and generalized social, political, and economic crisis. The queer would then imply a contradictory process in which such norms are simultaneously denatured and renaturalized, and describe forms of love and intimacy with a precarious social status outside the institutions of family, property, and couple form. So, as I examine cultural representations published in the tumultuous wake of World War II and the attendant crises that, of course, it precipitated, I'm very mindful of how queer post-war Japan indeed was, at a time when norms of gender and sexuality were significantly denatured and renaturalized, and as a particular formation of male same-sex color, too, culture, too, took shape within sexological discourses on the perverse, or the hentai, and the mysterious, the kitan. I think I have, these are sort of examples of those kind of words as they're employed in different journals of the time, and gradually cozied up with those values and institutions that helped them, quote, accrue material advantage, in Chidi's terms, in part by engaging with broader cultural narratives about economic struggle, wartime trauma, and empire. Again, I myself am still struggling to reconcile Chidi's historical and dialectical approach with my own appreciation of the fiction that I'm finding. But Chidi's attentiveness to the queerest process, and as a position of dispossession, as well as his understanding of sexual oppression as both cultural, i.e. sort of religious and moralistic, as well as economic, are issues that continue to haunt me as I think about narratives written by gay men, queer men in the 1970s, and find myself largely preceded by a body of Japanese scholarship that has tended to focus primarily on the recovering of the myriad of new, often queer sexualities that emerged in the immediate post-war period, the 40s and 50s, or celebrating the emergence of a kind of a new gay public in the 1970s, or alternatively engaging with models of imperialism centered largely on US empire and occupation, which have accordingly tended to shy away from the ways in which Japanese gay culture remained doggedly tied to the violent experiences of military service and Japanese empire. So before I work my way back to the 1970s, I want to linger momentarily on some of those very early formations of same-sex sexuality in the immediate post-war period, where World War II and its aftermath seem especially prominent in the construction of queer subjects. And here, I feel I can confidently fall back on Chidi's understanding of people inhabiting quite a precarious social status, often, but not always, outside the institutions of family, property, and couple form. There is, for example, a substantial record of both journalistic and fictional accounts that centralize the military as a site of both homosocial bonding and quite brutal hazing in ways that seem sometimes simultaneously critical and erotic and curiously didactic. One example might be found in the, oh goodness, do I not have, I thought I had that in there. Maybe I don't. I'm sorry, I don't have that for you. In the 1949 account, let me just, I'm sorry, I don't have that one for you. Male military prostitutes, or male prostitutes in military uniform. Gunpuku no dansho tachi, in which male sexuality is narrated as an experience with roots in the cruel pleasures in which imperial soldiers partook, but also as an experience particular to times of war, since the days of the samurai. In this story, after lecturing to an enlisted soldier on the history of same-sex love in Japanese culture, and right before initiating sexual contact with him, one senior officer pronounces that, quote, same-sex love between comrades cooperating in military duty helps to incite far more samurai spirit. Quote, in the middle of war, women simply won't do. You can see plenty of examples of that right here in the barracks, he continues. Grown-up men will end up falling for comfort women, doing all sorts of things day and night, even becoming dependent on these women. The soldier himself, aware of a universal history of same-sex love around the world, largely agrees with his senior officer, declaring that same-sex love is, quote, of a character much purer than heterosexual love, since deep friendships between male comrades are fundamentally rooted in something homosexual. So similar ideas circulated in the 1930s in the works of Iwata Junichi and Minakata Kumagusu, the latter of whom certainly emphasized the purity of male friendships. The main character in Gunpuku no Dansho Tachi admits to having fleetingly practiced the occasional act of sodomy when he was a young boy, and then again as an adolescent. But a new awareness of these competing narratives of gay sexuality seems to allow him to break free from the dominant sexological assumptions that same-sex love was properly contained to one's adolescence, and to assert in this particular piece how his gay sexuality, even as an adult, brought him great joy and even satisfaction. Indeed, his sustained engagement with other officers and soldiers in various couples and thruples, as he details them with delight, once again stirred up his homosexual desires and, quote, drew him into a strange ecstasy. Even after the war, the man survives the streets of post-war Tokyo as a male prostitute, quote, not, he emphasizes, as a panpan, but as an otoko no prostituto, emphasizing the foreign English term as though to steer clear from the stigmatized group of women who largely served U.S. soldiers and to remasculinize his new position as a sex worker, even as he found himself dressing up as a woman to support his wife and mother during the economically dire occupation period. And I'm really bedeviled why those images have disappeared on me. Oh, here we go. Okay. This is the story Genpuku no Tokotachi. And I just want to show you some of the slides, especially fascinating about this particular story and its competing perspectives on same-sex love, are the images associated with it, which illustrate this process of regendering quite vividly as the main character is gradually given the physical shape of a woman, in sharp contrast to how the narrator himself still sees himself in quite masculine terms. This tale of a military prostitute from 1949 is also especially interesting for the way in which it effectively stages this competition between sexological narratives of homosexuality, more cultural narratives that assert a long history in Japan under conditions of war and urban marketplace, and neocolonial narratives that generated very deep anxieties over the emasculinization of Japan by its US occupiers. So a wide variety of texts published in the 1950s and 1960s in Japan's Kasutori press especially continued to centralize and eroticize soldiers and the homosocial experience of life in the imperial army, again, in many different competing ways. These are just a few that I could throw up on the screen. Makimura So's 1958 story called Kanshitsu, which I think means like humidity, dry and wet, draws on the kind of saikaku-esque theme of a beautiful but malicious youth to set up the tale of a teenage boy during World War II whose father, a colonel in the army, enlists his subordinate to toughen up his artsy son. What follows, however, is a heated love triangle between a muscular captain, an effeminate high school teacher, and a sadistic teenager who in fact tortures the teacher who loves him, both physically and emotionally. The teenage boy ends up mercilessly manipulating both older men, who in one case slinks away in humiliation and in the other dies unmourned by the boy in battle. Let's see what else I have up there. Yes, on the other hand, this 1963 feature, The Army Was a Scene of, I guess you could say, male carnage, published in the journal Fuzoku Kitan, Strange Customs, again, not a gay magazine per se, but one of these magazines that focuses on perverse cultural practices, details in a highly graphic style different forms of brutal male hazing, even torture, in the imperial army, including images of submissive men in pornographically erotic poses, while sidestepping Japan's participation in any violence against colonial others. The brutality of an imperialist war of aggression becomes homoeroticized as an act of Japan on Japan penetration. And you can see how these kind of formal symmetries in an image like this of artwork seem to portray weapons and as these phallic tools penetrating available reclined bodies and other male bodies, either exploding up at the top on the battlefield or otherwise experiencing this kind of psychological trauma of wartime violence. Oda Toshimi's images, I'm going to skip over that. Oda Toshimi's images in this piece do not depict overt sexual acts per se, but the lecherous gazes of army doctors and senior officers certainly place front and center the vulnerability of male naked bodies in ways that invite voyeuristic responses, and hearkening back to early 20th century military practices in Japan that were, regardless of anyone's sexual orientation, quite universal in their degrading probing, and highly symbolic of the lawlessness and fascist nature of human relationships among Japanese on the home front. The captions printed alongside the opening image highlight the ambivalence of these military rituals for men who enjoyed sex with other men. This might be where I have the quote. Yeah. Army life under the Japanese militaristic state is often said to be a history of real darkness, fear, and cruelty. And yet, for those who experience these things with their own bodies, why do we, amidst these feelings, still experience something akin to nostalgia or yearning that is quite difficult to put into words? Now, in this particular work, far from an acknowledgement of a sexual preference for men, it is this fetishizing of sort of surveillance and celebration of control over other human bodies, regardless of their gender orientation, that seems to come to the foreground here in this perverse, certainly not gay magazine called Fuzoku Kitan. But even in the early 1970s issues of the gay male journal Barazoku, in which Yamaguchi's story appears, a journal that is often celebrated for its break away from an earlier discourse on perversion, we see abiding continuities with these perverse narratives in regular stories about humiliating wartime experiences, especially the military physical, the so-called emken, a practice initiated before the turn of the 20th century among new military conscripts and then later adopted in boys' schools, whereby military genitalia, M for either membrum or mara, this sort of Sanskrit word for it, were inspected ostensibly to check for venereal disease, but of course can also be seen as a means of kind of non-discursively sort of regulating male sexual bodies. The experience of war in journals like Barazoku sometimes appears sugar-coated with its focus on salubrious forms. So this is, I think, let me just forward. Yeah, this is the one I'm looking for. Sugar-coated with its salubrious forms of male bonding or coded jokes that make light of the situation. But often this imperial regulation of male bodies becomes eroticized in ways that in fact seem to be quite critical, in a kind of reappropriation of troubling practices of the wartime regime as a way of coping with related trauma and perhaps also celebrating new forms of post-war sexual autonomy. In these kinds of works, and there are many of them, writers often sought to come to terms with the extremely complicated and conflicted feelings surrounding these kinds of military inspections. Repressed same-sex desire, unintentional arousal in public, the humiliating groping of private parts by imperial officers who seem to take a sadistic pleasure in controlling violent bodies within a wartime system that ostensibly outlawed such decadent practices, but also depended on the fascist externalizations of submission and domination. By the mid-1970s, these post-war narratives of perverted same-sex desire in many ways give way to the emergence of gay male narratives that increasingly figure tropes of submission and domination in ways that seem largely disconnected from actual military settings and imperialist desires. And on this point, Yamaguchi's novella, it would seem, is somewhat of the exception. So here again is a novella serialized in 1977, 1978, which begins with this episode called Tsubureta Yoru. And this just happens to be the last episode on the right here. So we don't have a title for the entire piece. It's never serialized, never published in a book. Begins with this story and a young boy conscripted to labor in a dark, dingy wartime Japanese factory, and ends quite triumphantly in US-occupied Seoul, where the main protagonist finds sexual fulfillment not with an American beefcake or a Korean, hardly any Koreans even exist in this story, but rather with a handsome, muscular Japanese boy. Mobilized in a wartime factory on the inland sea with 100 of his classmates, Junji must work 12 hours a day, suffering all the while from exhaustion, malnourishment, dysentery. We learn that under these desperate conditions of forced labor and deprivation, even young teenage boys teeming with hormones are unable to entertain the thought, never mind actually engage in such things as masturbation or sexual exploration. In a factory full of Yakuza-connected young men, however, Junji and his friends soon become terrorized by these older workers in the factory and are subjected to regular beatings. Before long, in a long, drawn-out scene, the feminine-presenting Junji is pinned down, tied up, gagged with a dirty loincloth, and then gang-raped by several workers who take turns on the boy. The text lingers on each act of penetration and Junji's physical and mental responses, with vivid details about the workings of genitalia, skin, body parts, fluids of all sorts. A black and white image of the scene here portrays a small boy surrounded by three somewhat handsome, and handsomely muscled young men who are simultaneously enjoying him in striking contrast, that is, with the much more detailed and violent description. Yamaguchi's work is not untypical of Japanese S&M fiction in its incorporation of such violent scenes of bondage and rape, which, as I've kind of already suggested, are an ongoing theme in much of perverse post-war culture. But the highly detailed, quite abject descriptions of bodies in pain and pleasure seems altogether quite new. And Yamaguchi himself had plenty of practice learning how to write them, for he had spent the last 15 years or so writing about his own experiences looking for love and sex in private club subscription-based magazines such as Bara, as to be distinguished, of course, from the later Barazoku of the 70s, where he began writing in reader response columns about the gay bar scene in Yamaguchi-ken, and then started to submit stories of his own, some reminiscent of the 1950s Peplum films, sort of think Spartacus and Ben-Hur, before turning mostly to autoerotic ethnographic fiction about his own search for love and sex, including no less than 3 works based on his own experience as a young soldier living in Seoul. Let's see. Junji is eventually nursed back to health by a handsome, masculine older boy who has already captured his attention, and who can easily be read as the type of wakamono or a seinen, who scholars have argued represented the ideal older partner of a homosexual couple in the 1970s, and will play a recurrent role in Yamaguchi's stories as the sort of ever sought after and ever elusive, often straight objects of his romantic queer longings. Although Junji is determined to seek out revenge against his unidentified and unpunished perpetrators, he becomes depressed, even suicidal. But in the spring of 1945, as the war seems ever more unwinnable, Junji and a few friends are lucky enough to learn they will be sent to Seoul. And this move precipitates a major shift in the story's topography, as Junji makes the perilous boat trip to Korea through stormy, mine-ridden seas, meeting more handsome, protective, and highly affectionate older soldiers along the way. The terrors of wartime travel made bearable simply by the warmth of an older man's body holding him through the night. Until at last he arrives in Busan, and then Seoul, where he experiences, quote, the joys of rebirth, and emerges, quote, from the gray pupa into the form of a brightly colored butterfly. So this shift in setting effectively precipitates a shift in status, and in a way a shift in genre as well, from sort of proletarian dystopian fiction to colonial fantasy. First, Junji is assailed by the sights and sounds of a foreign city in ways that are also typical of Japanese visitors to Seoul in the colonial period, noting the stunning natural beauty, sort of smelly crowds of noisy people, architecture that seems colored by the past. But this coloniality, of course, brings with it new privileges. And here in Seoul, Junji is no longer at the bottom of the totem pole in the racialized hierarchies of empire. He even has younger boys, presumably Korean, quote unquote, who speak Japanese, help him with his luggage as he moves into the bachelor's dormitory, where workers from 16 to 20 years of age live an orderly, happy existence, quote, amidst the strong odor of male sweat, body oils, and sex. Indeed, Seoul becomes a place for the springs of adolescence to flow once again. These homosocial spaces in colonial Seoul thus become the backdrop for Yamaguchi to now linger on spectacular specimens of naked Japanese masculinity. Having passed through the traumas of factory work and sexual violence, Junji is now prepared to resist the erotic hazing rituals of his darker dorm mates, curiously all from Kyushu, who target him for, quote, his flawlessly white skin and feminine mode of speaking. If he also has the help of a few handsome, heroic young men who also come to his rescue and treat him as a younger brother. This first episode in Yamaguchi's novella concludes with a masterful servicing on one of these older boys named Matsumoto, as Junji is finally constructed into a character who has effectively recuperated his early trauma by using his new knowledge of sex and its powers to intensify the erotic experiences of others, and thus to gain a kind of confident sense of sexual mastery and autonomy. The first episode of Yamaguchi's serialized novel thus seems to come full circle, as Junji himself becomes reborn as a little devil, looking for victims himself. What we see in part in this first half of Yamaguchi's tale conforms to what John O'Macintosh, again, I think perhaps I've already mentioned this in his detailed examination of how gay men constructed their own erotic lives in Barazoku, especially in the personal ads in the 1970s, whereby a key component of the preferred gay relationship is this age gap of sorts between a younger boy and a father or older brother-like figure. Later episodes of Yamaguchi's novella, the last called Youth Aflame in Foreign Land, continue with Junji's story, but dramatically complicate the racialized circuits of desire, as the text is peopled with American soldiers who physically tower over Junji against the background of a chaotic Korean city. Now living amongst a small group of Japanese workers in Seoul, Junji seems to live well thanks to a storehouse of goods his Japanese superiors had managed to sequester at the end of the war for their own survival. But signs of interethnic gender trouble soon emerge as Junji attracts the attention of one particular American soldier called Renato. Not blonde or blue-eyed, with dark skin and dark hair, even overweight, Renato is incredibly kind and charms Junji with his generosity, stereotypically with luxurious pieces of chocolate and sweet swelling soaps. But when Junji gives Renato a Japanese doll, in thanks for his kindness, he is subsequently femme-shamed, not by Renato, but by other Americans in the Governor General's office, and even in the voice of the senior American officer, presumably Horace Grant Underwood II. Hey, aren't you really just a girl? Even Colonel Underwood had said it too. I wonder if Mr. Shioda's secretary boy is just a cross-dressing girl. Take off your trousers, boy, and let's let everyone see. God damn it, Junji thought to himself. His face flashed bright red as he felt an onslaught of tears coming on. With a shrill soprano voice at the age of 16 and bright white skin, again, without a single blemish, Junji could hardly escape being mistaken for a girl. Junji's body, too, which had absorbed the fluids of countless young men, countless times, may have indeed been infused with a strange eroticism by now that made some men tremble, even unbeknownst to Junji himself, unquote. So only the voice of Americans in Yamaguchi's story transmits this kind of sort of shaming homophobic language, which Junji seems entirely surprised by and sort of encountering for the very first time. Meanwhile, Junji has quickly learned to communicate with Renato in English and even guides him around the streets of Seoul and a garden where they eventually share a passionate kiss. But despite his efforts to stick up for his new Japanese friend, however, Renato's attempts to pressure Junji into kind of oral sex are rebuffed when Junji realizes the enormity of what he's dealing with. The circuits of desire in Yamaguchi's story have clearly set up Junji as sexually promiscuous, but also as a boy who longs after a masculine, protective wakamono, not unlike Renato himself. His refusal of the American soldier is not very ambiguous, but it is also coded in the kind of Occidentalism that, again, Macintosh suggests was quite common in gay Japanese as a gay Japanese response to American otherness, a distorted kind of exoticization of Western bodies that created ways of knowing and objectifying the American soldier in an effort to preserve a kind of Japanese manliness. Renato may not fit the bill for several reasons, but the arc of Yamaguchi's story emphasizes the way in which Japanese boys are far more appropriate for Junji than Americans. When cramped living space among the Japanese leads Junji and another bunkmate named Yoshio to share the same futon, the two boys end up hitting it off. The story lingers again on several protracted scenes of sex between Junji and the more modestly endowed Yoshio. This pornographic narrative is briefly interrupted, however, with a generic twist, when the Japanese living quarters are robbed by thieves speaking accented Japanese, and leaving the story riddled with generalizations about the violent and corrupt nature of Koreans. But even this brief narrative of Korean criminality proves enabling for the Japanese homosexuals, because it becomes the opportunity for Junji and Yoshio to stay up together each night as watchmen. in the Japanese boarding house and to enjoy their bodies under the bright white glare of newly installed security lights. By this time, the teenage boys have fully grown into their sexual partnership. Quote, the two boys had practically fused into a single body, and even when they weren't in each other's sight, they still immediately started reaching out to touch each other's body. No matter how much they tried playing adult, they were still in their teenage years, and a time of sexual fervor had descended on the two boys like a storm. So the story finally concludes with the boys' safe train journey back to Japan. And in the end, Yamaguchi's novel has brought Junji again around full circle in many ways, having escaped the sexual abuses of his fellow countrymen in the lawless wartime factory and in his barracks in Seoul, having rejected the shaming and feminizing interactions with US soldiers, even those who have courted him with kindness, and having survived the dangers of Korean criminals in the newly independent former Japanese colony, Junji has gained important sexual experience and now safely returned from the wartime colonies as a young man with self-affirming experiences. The opportunity, at least under US occupation, to become an autonomous, sexual, active teenager against the backdrop of Japan's former Korean colony, with a chance to understand himself as a Japanese youth who unapologetically enjoys sex with other Japanese boys just like him. So it's actually quite fascinating. I sort of read this story with my students as well, and these are some of the things we came up with. How the story kinds of navigates a series of dichotomies in this novel as it traverses from the preserved to sort of normative sexuality in some ways, marking yes, and so we can see how there's like this narrative dispossession to status-bearing subjecthood, from sexual trauma to satisfaction, submission and domination in the factory to very consensual relationships, something that focuses very much on the past, that something is much more future-forward, thinking about the relationships he'll have in the future. This contrast between the child and adolescent, even in the language, the sort of being the object of criminal desire on the one hand and of Western desire on the other. Notion of Japanese criminality in the mainland shifts to kind of Korean criminality in the colonial space, and of course the shift from kind of wartime to peacetime, or at least post-colonialism, a post-colonial moment. Building off of residual S&M narratives that had within the context of perverse magazine culture long sought to make sense of same-sex love in relationship to Japan's history as a fascist military regime. Yamaguchi Jun offers, on the one hand, a remarkable story of gay resilience that suggests Junji has not only internalized, but recuperated his early wartime trauma and transformed it into a deeply satisfying process of sexual awakening, as well as the makings of a newly emerging gay identity that magazines like Barazoku and its burgeoning community of readers who had never experienced the war themselves were in the process of shaping. At the same time, however, given how heavily these colonial tropes and spaces also saturate, the latter part of Yamaguchi's novella, this sexual autonomy, let's also, reference Chidi and call it an accrued status, has come at a cost. It engages in a kind of colorism that could be seen as shaming many of his own fellow Japanese. It also erases soul of its Korean population largely. And of course, its own horrific history of sexual violence, militarized masculinity, cultural loss at the hands of Japanese soldiers and bureaucrats alike, except for, of course, these key moments when Korean criminality provides the opportunity for an intensified sexual experience and bonding between Japanese men. Yamaguchi's story indexes a kind of profound shift from a queer perversity to a gay kind of normativity. So I've already suggested in part some of the conditions that made this kind of autoerotic ethnography possible, this compromised space for sharing of sexual stories. Yamaguchi's text may be highly pornographic, indeed offensive in its erasure of the Korean experience, but it also manages to steer clear of an equally, let's say, troublesome constellation of narratives that was at this very same time colonizing the gay press. Indeed, one need only turn a few pages away from Yamaguchi's own novella to find in the very same issue of Barazoku how the arc of Yamaguchi's narrative is in fact mirrored in a much broader pivot to other Asian countries that Japanese gay magazines were making in the late 70s and 80s. Oh goodness, what happened there? Let's see the broader pivot to other Asian countries that Japanese gay magazines were making in the late 70s and 80s, at least before the AIDS crisis. The final installment of Yamaguchi's novella was in fact published alongside two travel essays, including a report about gay life in New York City, as well as a piece by Mihara Jiro called A Record of Infiltration into Male-to-Male Paradise, which recounts the writer's sexy night in Manila, chasing brown boys and drawing on the idea of a gay paradise that was also common in several European magazines and popular gay guides, such as the German Du und Ich, Spartacus, and the Golden Key, which, as Christopher Ewing has shown, quote, reinforced and rearticulated long-standing racial stereotypes for a West German gay audience. This kind of cosmopolitan travel narrative, and I have a few others to show to you, also mark the abiding influence of global forms of gay culture on Japanese magazines. Other pieces, such as a Korea report in the journal Zage from mid-1980s, starts off with a heady discussion of the North Korean attempted assassination of the South Korean president in Burma, but then quickly turns to explore Seoul's nightlife and narrates the journalist's emotional manipulation of a young bartender in Korea. He is given by the master of a bar manipulation into a night of sex and a sexual, sort of sexploitative sort of photo shoot, which ends in the beautiful boy crying out, "I go," in his sexual release. These horrifying pieces seem to be kind of the flip side of the much more progressive politics of that other story I mentioned at the very beginning of my talk, Ozaki Gensuke's story, which weaves together political, erotic, and commercial narrative threads in an effort to kind of forge trans-ethnic solidarities between Japanese and Koreans. When we also dive deeper into Yamaguchi's life history and the extensive record of autoerotic ethnographies that he left behind, we might also pause before extending our own 21st century judgment on his efforts to reconstruct a version of his own kind of, I guess you could say, sexual citizenship. I have up here a tentative mokuroku, or index of all the stories that I've been able to actually find. Oh, okay. Manila Sexy Night, the same issue as one of the episodes from his story, which traffics in this kind of typical vocabulary that we see in travel narratives around the world. This is another example in the game magazine Sabu. This is actually a decade later. The build up to the Olympics is really important in the sort of figuring of Korea in these kind of gay magazines. And then finally, this kind of Korea report, which is like it looks like a news sort of serious journalism, but it actually becomes this very tawdry sort of piece of sexploitation. And then, of course, this is the story that I should have talked about today, but I ended up not talking about. But maybe I can in the Q&A period, which is much more political in nature and kind of resonates with ways of connecting and sort of foregrounding Japan's own complicity in the oppression of Koreans under authoritarian rule. But onward to Yamaguchi's Sakui Mokuroku. These are all the pieces that I found. There are two pieces of sort of kind of criticism I have not read or published early in the 50s. I think this is when he was trying to make an attempt at being a movie critic or something in Tokyo, which fails. These are all the things that I've been able to collect. Many, if not most of these works, details a very melancholic history of a search for true love, beginning with his 6 years working as a telephone operator at the Yamaguchi City Fire Station after the war, his feminine voice apparently being suitable for this particular job, where his colleagues urged him to cuddle up with new recruits in the dorm on the second floor, and he resorted to a telescope atop the fire station to spy on male students in a dorm across the street when he felt lonely. In these accounts, he also details his work as a traveling salesman, which in fact brought him into contact with many queer people in the publishing industry. His short-lived attempt to refashion himself into a critic in Tokyo, and then eventually a decade of arduous work in the mizu shobai business in northern Kyushu, where he was often cheated by lecherous and parsimonious owners of seedy bars, and himself had to take advantage, or found himself taking advantage of straight customers, too drunk to notice that he was actually a man. He also describes a touching scene at his mother's deathbed when he was still in his early 20s, who told him she would never rest in peace until he turned into a proper man and found a wife. These accounts would seem to suggest that Yamaguchi certainly lived a precarious life himself, had occupied a social status for much of it that lay, again to quote Chitty, outside the institutions of family, property, and couple form. So we might in fact be more inclined to marvel at the determination of a man to narrate his past as a queer person in the world, to emphasize the extraordinary resilience of an organic intellectual enabled by the appearance of these new institutions and communities of erotic magazine readers, rather than linger on the colonial underbelly of his writings or ruminate on the ways in which gay men have participated in and endorsed fascist tropes and racist colonial systems of language that have perhaps marginalized themselves as much as others. Yamaguchi's post-colonial fantasy, this pornographic Bildungsroman that projects a contemporary gay identity ahistorically into the distant past, would seem to be the very last piece of writing that Yamaguchi ever published, at least in the journal Barazoku, so far as I can tell, and anywhere else. Now let's see. What to say in conclusion across the street. I wasn't sure how to conclude this because there's so many open-ended threads to this talk, and there's so many different ways that I might have gone. But I thought that I'd just end with a couple questions. What do we call a work of gay fiction written by a queer writer? Is this identity work, a term coined by sociologists interested in understanding the ways identities are modified in order to be accepted, listened to, engaged with? Am I making perhaps too much of these problematic popular writers? And should I turn my attention to the affirmation of fiction, much as I did in my proletarian work? To fiction written by people like Ozaki, who use sexuality not necessarily in unproblematic ways, but as the occasion to highlight colonial oppression and Japan's complicity in it, even as they were wedded to forms of erotic writing and even pornographic language. And finally, am I wrong to wonder what happened to these queer writers who had no biological heirs, whose copyrights are perhaps unknowingly owned by distant aunts or distant nieces and nephews, and whose work will thus never see the light of day according to current copyright laws? Writers who Japanese scholarship has largely ignored for decades, perhaps because of the very traumas that kept these writers so attached to structures of writing and erotic experiences that were inseparable from an engagement with wartime violence and empire in their youths. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you for listening and indulging me in this talk. And I'm very happy that we have a chance to have a conversation about some of these things.